Welcome to the CFN webinar series. Today we have volunteer and healthcare provider partnerships to provide navigation for rural, frail, older adults. The webinar is be broken down into two sections. One is the presentation from two of our presenters today, and then a Q&A later. So please, during the presentation, use the question functionality and go to webinar and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible today. The webinar is recorded and will be up and available for viewing within 1 or 2 days, as well as the slides. I can't seem to move my slide. Yeah. Just my slide deck just stopped. But today the presenters are Barbara Passett, an associate professor of nursing at the University of British Columbia. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Health Ethics and Diversity. She earned her undergraduate degree in nursing at the University of Victoria and her master's and PhD in nursing at UBC. We also have Wendy Duggleby, who will also be presenting and answering questions today. She is a professor in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta. She's an endowed nursing research chair in aging and quality of life and the director of the Innovations in Senior Care Research Unit in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Nursing at the University of Saskatchewan, her Master's of Nursing at the University of Alberta, and her PhD in Nursing at the University of Texas Houston Health Science Center. So Barbara, you're going to start today, so please proceed.
There we go. All right, can you hear me okay there, Carol?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, Wendy and I are delighted to be here today and to present this project, and thank you so much for joining us. The real focus of our program of research here is to really find ways to support older adults who are living early on in the palliative trajectory. So we're going to present a pilot project called NCARE that we completed last year. The title of this project is Volunteer Healthcare Provider Navigators in Partnership with Older Adults Living with Advancing Chronic Illness, and the acronym NCARE stands for Navigating, Connecting, Accessing, Resourcing, and Engaging. So as we present today, we really have three objectives. The first is to provide a background to the challenges older adults are experiencing as they live, particularly in rural areas with advancing chronic illness. To share the findings of our pilot study NCARE, a volunteer healthcare provider navigation for this particular population, and then to really sort of talk about and to help understand the potential of this model to meet the needs of an aging population in Canada. So I'm going to start with providing a bit of background on the challenges older adults are facing. Sorry, I've just had a screen freeze here, so let me see if we can get, there we go. Okay, I like to show this particular picture when I talk about this population. If you look closely, this is a picture of a snail who I encountered when I was walking on the trail one day, who had picked up a horsehair around his shell, and after picking up that horsehair had gone on to pick up all kinds of debris from the trail. And so at the time that I encountered this snail, this is a picture of my feet here in proportion to the length of the trail that this snail had going on behind him, and he was just laboring across the trail trying to continue to make progress. And for me, this is a really good sort of picture of what older adults often struggle with when they're living at home with advancing chronic illness. And some of the challenges I think that they're experiencing are really lack of early supportive care, lack of knowledge of available resources, some of the risks associated with transitions in care, and it's really compounded by some of the underutilization of volunteer hospice capacities that do exist to help them. And so I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. You may have seen this slide before. It was done by Douglas McGregor and Pat Porterfield, and I really like this slide because it really shows this sort of nice picture of a trajectory of what happens for palliative patients and some of the transition points as they go down that trajectory. So this is meant really to be a time with various transitions on them that start with the time of diagnosis, and then a transition one that really represents disease advancement, and then onwards down in the palliative trajectory. And I've put the arrow where we're focusing on in this particular project, and that's really between that transition 1 and 2, which focuses on disease advancement. So older adults at this point are beginning to experience heavy symptom burden. They may not yet be eligible or be requesting palliative benefits per se, and so really their team, particularly in rural areas at this point, is still their primary care physician and often don't have the benefit of home care services. So in my mind, this is a really critical time in terms of bringing that early support that we talk about. It's interesting, as we talk to older adults in the rural communities, you know, the analogy that kind of works for them during this time is they often feel like Humpty Dumpty sitting on the wall. So their symptoms are such that they feel like they're teetering there, one day doing well and the next day not, and not yet really figuring out how to manage those things. Prior to this NCARE study, we completed a study called TCare, which was a 2-year pilot of providing a nurse navigator in the home for this same population. And as we did that over a 2-year period, we mapped longitudinal quality of life scores using the McGill Quality of Life questionnaire. And it was really interesting because what we found with the participants on the TCare study, and these again were the same population, upstream palliative population living with advanced chronic illness, approximately 50% of the older adults in our study consistently reported quality of life scores that indicated that they were having a bad day. So that gives you some sense. There's other good articles in the literature that talk about the symptoms that this population struggles with, but our research in that TCare project certainly supported the type of quality of life challenges this population is living with. Compounded by that is the fact that they're still so early on with so many few supports around them that they may not know what's available to them or to how to get access to those resources. And it's very interesting for those of us that have done research in rural communities. What's a real paradox is you often think that, you know, rural communities are so small that people would know what's available to them. And what's really interesting is in our experience that's not the case at all. That often in these rural communities there are all kinds of hidden resources, whether they be volunteer organizations that people have started to meet a particular need. They're kind of hidden healthcare resources. But what is often characterized in these communities is that often nobody really knows where all these resources are. We landed in a rural community once, a very small community, to do a focus group with rural older adults, and their greatest concern was lack of access to transportation. And it was really interesting for us because as we'd come into the community, we'd kind of done a quick community survey about what was available there, and indeed there were all kinds of volunteer driver services. And so that's really what I'm talking about here, is that there's all these hidden resources in communities typically, but older adults don't know where they are or how to get to them. The other thing, of course, we know is the challenges with transitions in care. This is a large part of Wendy's program of research. We know that for this population, one of the most important things that contribute to their quality of life is that they want to be cared for by people they know and who are available to them. So this idea of rural individuals being kept close to home as much as possible is a really powerful one in terms of quality of life. And part of that is because of the risks that occur when we do put older adults in transition. So I'm sure this is the picture, of course, of the London Tube, where everywhere you have these glaring signs to remind us, mind the gap, that you don't fall between the cracks as you get onto the tube. And I think that's how we need to think about this group of older adults as well. The fact whether we're transferring them between institutions, between home and institutions, or where we're asking them to travel outside of their community for specialist care. This is often where they experience challenges, where safety issues arise, and where they'll tell us that their quality of life is influenced. Just to give you some sense of really the level of risk, I think, for this population is in this same TCare study where we mapped longitudinal quality of life. We also mapped healthcare utilization over a 2-year period for these rural individuals. And we were actually stunned. We knew that they had contact with a lot of healthcare providers. It wasn't until we actually mapped this systematically that we realized just how many we were talking about. So we had 25 older adults that we followed longitudinally. These 25 older adults had contact with 33 different healthcare related groups over that time, of which 23 of those were different physician specialties. And so this was really surprising to us, and as you can imagine, as the navigator, the nurse navigator dealt with them over that 2-year period, you know, one of their greatest concerns was the vast amount of information and sometimes contradictory information that they were getting from all of these different healthcare related groups, the challenges in making sense of it, and you can appreciate the challenges that presented for them. The other thing that we've really found in these rural communities is that in each of these communities, just as there is all of this capacity in terms of resources that people may not be aware of, there's often also an underutilization of very valuable hospice capacity. So across rural communities, there's really variable integration of hospice into healthcare services, right from a continuum where they're fully a part of the team that exists in this rural community, and as soon as somebody is referred to the palliative program, volunteers immediately are integrated, to the point where the other end of the trajectory where you have you know, trained hospice volunteers waiting to get involved without that connection to healthcare services. And oftentimes when you interview hospice volunteers in these communities, they'll say that, you know, one of their greatest challenges is really being introduced too late into the palliative trajectory to make a difference. Of course, you know, I think when you think about these kind of challenges that arise for older adults, everybody's dream in these communities is to have a freestanding hospice house. And this is kind of the thing that we aspire to in hoping that it will solve some of these challenges that we think about. But we also know that it takes a particular population and a fair amount of money to begin to have these freestanding hospice houses, and so many of these rural communities won't be able to realize that dream. And so we need to begin to think about how to solve these challenges in other ways, which really brought us to the question of, can we build a hospice-like model? And really what we're thinking about here is thinking about hospice as place, not space. So it's not just a physical building that we build or a physical space, but how can we create places that are really flexible in terms of bringing the hospice philosophy in. And so the 3 principles upon which we're really thinking about the NCARE program is that care really is embedded within a constellation of community relationships, that supportive care begins early, and that we facilitate people's access to available resources using a best fit approach. So that idea of a very patient-centered approach to this in terms of what individuals need and want in relation to what may or may not be available again in their community. Which really brings us to our topic then, our pilot project that we completed, which was a 1-year pilot testing the feasibility of a volunteer healthcare provider navigation partnership to support frail rural dwelling older adults. And I want to stop and just acknowledge the marvelous partners that we've had on this project. We've had generous funding, both from, from the Canadian Frailty Network, the Vancouver Foundation, the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, CHPCA, Pallium, a variety of other funding partners, and just an investigative team and knowledge partners that have just given generously of their time and energy. So we're just very grateful for the really good team that we've had on this. So what we're envisioning is you kind of step back and think, well, where does NCARE fit into kind of the broader model of hospice care? Is we're really envisioning an upstream role for volunteers within hospice. So just as, within most hospice societies, we have bereavement volunteers who have specialized training. We have hospice volunteers who have specialized training. We're now envisioning that we would also have NCARE volunteers who would have specialized training to do a very unique upstream role. And really the model builds upon this idea of cancer care navigation. So if you're familiar with the cancer care navigation literature, they've done a lot of really good work in terms of thinking about how to navigate individuals through a very sophisticated and complex cancer care navigation system. And certainly that's probably the origin of this idea, but this idea of NCARE navigation is actually quite different because its major focus is not really within healthcare, although we're certainly looking at helping people to navigate healthcare in some way, but really the broader focus is within the variety of health and social care available within the community, and not just formal social care services, but very informal supportive networks as well. So, what is the constellation of supportive networks available to this older adult in their community, which, may begin with family, extend to neighbors and other supportive contacts that they have in the community, churches, and so just a whole variety of health and social care. So in that sense, it's actually quite different than what occurs within cancer care navigation. There's very robust theoretical work upon which this NCARE model has been developed. Wendy has done some really great work in terms of navigation competencies for the care of older rural adults at the end of life. She led a CIHR study that was a Delphi study in which international experts were brought together to construct this set of competencies for what it would take to navigate rural older adults. And that report is available online. It's really helpful because not only does it include the navigation competencies upon which this program is based, but it really provides actually broad background to the topic as well. Everything from navigation to what it's like to live in a rural area for older adults. So yeah, that report is available online and is very helpful to understand what we're doing here in a little bit more detail. I also have to acknowledge at this point Brenda Hooper, who is the advanced practice nurse and hospice champion, who's been very integral to this project. She was the two-year nurse navigator on the TCare project and was also the nurse navigator assisting the volunteers on this NCARE project. And she's off doing volunteer training today, but I did want to just introduce you to her as well. So what is the NCARE intervention? It begins with education. These are already trained hospice volunteers who then get a 2-day workshop in navigation, and then throughout the intervention they meet with the nurse navigator coach every 6 weeks to get ongoing mentoring and coaching. After they've received that education, they then visit older adults in the home every 2 to 3 weeks over a 1-year period for this pilot. And their focus within those home visits are to provide navigation support. And then, of course, they collected data as part of the research project. And then at the end, at the 6 months and at 12 months in this 1-year pilot, we collected volunteer self-efficacy and navigation and their satisfaction with the role. From older adults, we collected satisfaction, self-efficacy, and navigation, and then we completed a variety of semi-structured interviews with volunteers and older adults to better understand what their experiences were within the pilot. These are just the title pages of the learning manuals that we developed to accompany the workshop. There is a learning manual both for the volunteers and for healthcare providers who would support these volunteers, not necessarily for a healthcare provider navigator, but for your average healthcare provider who would want to support a volunteer in this role. And so these manuals were developed for the pilot. They went through testing both within the initial workshop. We got a feedback from a number of stakeholders on the manuals and have since been revised and are now actually in their second or third iteration. So they're getting very close to settling in a place where they've had a substantive amount of feedback. Within these manuals, the volunteers are really supported to develop 5 main competencies. One is to provide client and family screening. Second is to advocate for the client and family. Third is to facilitate community connections. 4 is to coordinate access to services and resources. And 5, to promote active engagement. So there's a chapter developed to each, or devoted to each of these 5 competencies, and then additional work in terms of getting oriented to the navigator role. In that initial workshop, we did do an evaluation in the pilot in terms of these domains. 5 is the best possible response, and so you can see that the evaluation was fairly positive. The only one that slipped a little bit below that 4 mark was the length of the training, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we learned from volunteers in terms of the sufficiency of the training for the role that they were being asked to do. We recruited 7 volunteers for this pilot, 18 older adults, 3 family members that were attached to 3 of those older adults. It wasn't required that family members join because, of course, in many cases these older adults will be people living at home who don't have family members at home. And then we had a nurse navigator with oversight and coaching roles as part of the project. So what did they do over that 1-year period in terms of their participant visits? Believe it or not, over that 1 year, they conducted a total number of 252 visits, of which 59 were by the nurse navigator. On this project, the nurse navigator stayed quite involved with the older adults just to ensure that this was an acceptable intervention for them and to ensure that things were going well. The volunteer navigators conducted 176 visits, and there were 17 visits that were combined visits. Typically with the intervention, some of those early visits were combined both with the nurse and the volunteer navigator. We asked them to conduct visits about every 2 to 3 weeks, but we really left the scheduling up to the older adult and the volunteer to decide what was acceptable between the 2 of them. The mean days between visits ended up, interestingly enough, right between that 2 to 3 weeks at about 18 days. The length of the visits were really variable, anywhere in person from 10 minutes to 210 minutes with a mean of about 1 hour and 20 minutes, and by phone similar. The option they could visit in person. In some cases they could also visit by phone if the older adult wasn't feeling well or if the roads were bad, just for a variety of reasons. One of the things that we tracked were the declined visits. So I think in rural areas in particular, older adults are reluctant to ask to be removed from a service if it's not meeting their needs. But where you may see that is in declined visits. So we tracked those very carefully. There were only 46 declined visits, and the reasons, were good ones. They were either that people just weren't feeling well at the time and they weren't up to having a visit. They might be healthcare scheduling conflicts or social family obligations, and there were really only a couple of visits where it really wasn't clear why they were canceled. So we thought that was actually a pretty good indicator in terms of the acceptability of the intervention. So I'm going to move now into talking about what did they do. It's really interesting because when you design a new role, I think you begin your pilot project with some idea of what you think those volunteer navigators will do, and then you just need to look at very carefully of what it was that they were able to do. And I must say that as a research team, we were just quite struck by their capacities in terms of what it was that they were able to do and the broad diversity of things that they did do in this role of navigation. And I'm just going to mention a few today in the interest of time. There were many, many more. So of course one of the roles that they had was really connecting to others. A fair bit of time was spent just building rapport through social conversations, helping them to identify and build their social connections, and then a lot of time spent facilitating discussions around illness, coping, and overall life impact. So these older adults just had a real need to talk about how their lives were changing in relation to their complex chronic illness. Another role that they had was accessing available services and resources. They spent a fair bit of time talking about strategies to work with their healthcare providers. So this could be things like helping them to identify what their priority problems are. I'm not sure if you have this in your provinces, but within BC there's been a movement toward GP visits being structured around a one problem, one visit approach. And this has actually been challenging for some of the older adults in our studies because they're coping with multiple problems. So the volunteer, would just simply spend time helping them to identify what the things were that they needed to bring up with their physician, how to bring up sensitive medical issues, how to understand physician behaviors, using advocates, helping them to set up regular home physician visits, and how to plan conversations. Mobility options, they spent some time helping people know how to support access as their mobility decreased. Resourcing according to need, a lot happened in this domain. They could be things like healthcare services, home support services, available living options in the community, life changes, things such as, how to get rid of their possessions, how to structure moving arrangements, home safety and efficiency strategies, comfort adaptations, things as simple as replacing old shoes, seniors resources available to them in the community, and helping these older adults to be aware of policy changes. We had MSP changes during this time that had implications for them financially, and so the volunteers were able to work with them, making sure that they knew of these things and could access those. Engaging with life. This was a really important focus both for the older adults and the volunteers. They helped them with options for illness self-management, renewing old hobbies, seniors activity planning, a lot around advanced care planning, things like helping them do funeral home visits, writing out things that they wanted healthcare providers to know. We were surprised at how many of these older adults wanted to continue to be involved in philanthropic work, as they were still in that process of really wanting to live very actively. So one volunteer was helping an older adult help refugees moving into the community, and a number of strategies for helping them to prepare for stressful life events. In BC, they have to renew their driver's license at strategic intervals, and so it was working with them and helping to coach them through those changes. So I'll now move into presenting some of the findings. We did do evaluation at 6 months and at 12 months, and we were very grateful that we did that because there were actually quite different findings at 6 months and at 12, simply because it took some time for people to adjust into the role and to get comfortable with what it was that they were doing. 11 clients took part in the 6 month. When asked how important the service was to them at 6 months, the mean rating on that was a 9 out of 10. They rated themselves on self-efficacy anywhere from 2.91 to 3.55 on a 4-point scale. We did have one older adult withdraw at 6 months simply because he felt that he was really too well for this service, and it wasn't really adding too much for him at that point, but all of the other older adults progressed on. Benefits that they talked about at the 6 months: confidence in being able to ask for help, having someone knowledgeable and available, knowing there was backup when needed, helping put things into context and bringing awareness of available resources. However, at this point, at the 6-month interval, navigation was not well understood by the clients. 10 volunteers and healthcare navigators took part at the 6-month. There was no attrition of volunteers at the 6-month. What we did with the project is we assumed that they were going to be off the project at 6 months unless they wanted to go forward into the second 6-month period. So again, so if they didn't have to put their hands up and say, I want to withdraw from this study, it was just assumed that that they needed to renew, and all volunteers went forward again at the 6-month. We asked them, do you feel that working as a navigator contributes to your personal well-being? That was 1.7 out of 4, with the lower better on this scale. Would you do the role again and recommend it to others? 1.43 out of 4. We did, of course, some overall program evaluation of NCARE. I won't go through all of these, but basically very positive perceptions of the program, their feelings of how it met a need in their community, whether they felt it was well designed, well planned, and that was fairly positive. Some of the less positive perceptions at the 6 months were completing the navigation activities that they wanted to, some role uncertainty here for volunteers, and concerns about sustainability. Already at the 6-month they were asking, can this program be sustained in our community past the 1-year time period? 12-month findings now. Let's start with the volunteer perspectives first. And these are some quotes primarily from the qualitative interviews that we completed at the 12-month. We did them both, but so this is kind of a summary at the 12 months. Overall, the volunteers found this a very satisfying and meaningful role. Some of their quotes, I think we make it easier, meaning the participants, for them to go down that path of illness. Another quote, we're helping people navigate this time of life on an emotional level. And that satisfying and meaningful role was certainly reciprocal, as this participant said. These people really touched me, and I got a lot from them as well. I hope I gave them something, but you know, they became friends and a part of my life. The volunteers were still struggling with some role ambiguity by the 12-month interval. They were a bit unsure about their role expectations, about how robust their contributions to care were, and how to measure their performance in this new role. I almost wish we could have done the older adult evaluation first and fed this back to them, because I think it would have changed that perception a bit. But as this volunteer said, sometimes just providing that safe environment for someone to ventilate about their issues, maybe that's my criteria for success. Suggestions for service improvement: certainly more flexibility in visit schedules. They needed ongoing professional development and mentorship, and some felt that there needed to be more careful screening of clients' perceived needs, and I think that was probably related to the one older adult that withdrew from the service at 6 months. Service sustainability, again, they would do the role and recommend it to others. They felt it filled an important need in the community. They did feel it required more public awareness and perhaps some stronger formal links to healthcare services. So what about the client and family perspectives then? What was really interesting in these interviews is older adults spoke a fair bit about why they felt a service of this nature was important to them, and it had to do with both their nature of chronic illness and their nature of aging in our society. And so here are some sort of qualitative quotes about what it feels like to have this chronic illness experience. One older adult says, it causes a feeling of isolation and aloneness. Others treat you differently. Another one said, so this is a whole new experience now. It is life-changing. I'm here and I'm alone. And am I lonely? Well, yes, I guess I probably am. Another participant said, when you've been sick for a long time, after a while everything disappears and all your stability. And this final quote is actually from a couple who were living together and both coping with advancing chronic illness, and it was putting a great deal of stress. And this particular participant said, you know, it's just like two illnesses fighting here. You know, there's two sick people, and once in a while you say something you would never say normally, and it takes you back again and again. Is this the person I've become? So they talk quite poignantly about the burden of chronic illness, and layered on top of that was really the stigma that they felt in relation to aging, and their consciousness of how much media attention is being given to the aging population and the burden that it's putting on the healthcare system. A couple of quotes from this. One participant said, I've never been sick my whole life, and so this being older is a new experience for me. So let's see what it's all about. Another talked about the challenges that she was having her doctor understand because of the limited time that she really had with physicians' appointments. And she said, my doctor doesn't know me well enough to understand, and really she just doesn't have time for that. And a third participant said, you know, you hear a lot about our generation and the burden that we are placing actually on the system. And so these were the things that they talked about when they talked about why the service was important. In terms of the experiences of the NCARE intervention, they valued the volunteers who approached them professionally but with a lay attitude. They liked that these volunteers weren't medicalizing their experience, but they still were very professional. They had a lot of good things to say about who the volunteers were as people. They talked about the visits being very warm and non-intimidating, but they did desire more flexible visits. They really felt that these visits that happened fairly regularly at times made them dwell too much, perhaps on their chronic illness, and there were times when they were still feeling quite good and wanted not to think about it. The thing that they really appreciated were the benefits of person-centered care. I think there was some early confusion and some disappointment about the fact that these NCARE volunteers weren't giving them instrumental support, but that was replaced fairly quickly about a deeper understanding. And that was really typified in this one quote. This participant said, you know, it was, how are things going? And then I opened my mouth and we started to talk about what I felt we needed to talk about, and it didn't seem like they were on about this or that, or we must talk about this today. It was more fitting of my needs each time. And this participant said it's not so much about the medical, it was about putting things in context. Older adults really talked about the benefits of assistance with decision making. They valued that the volunteers really helped them to anticipate what might be coming and to signpost for them, helping them to know, to make plans in relation to that. And they really appreciated that it was in the moment information rather than too much information at once. And this participant talked about, you know, feeling all 6s and 7s. And when the volunteers come in, we can sit and talk about this or that. And so they really understood why things were occurring, and oh, what a difference that makes. They appreciated the benefit of a social safety net, that there was a lot of uncertainty with chronic illness, that they were developing these relationships of trust, that was somebody that they could call upon when they needed to be hospitalized or something else that would happened, and that they really felt they could safely engage conversations that they might be afraid to address with other people that were more close to them. Definitely benefits of engagement. So this participant said, you know, I was really surprised by how much it does help the minute she comes in. And later on I said to someone just the other day, you know, I did this and I didn't realize I could still do it. Another participant said, somehow you feel more alive when you're ahead of the game. You've got something going there, and this program does help. We had one older adult who at the beginning of the program described himself as feeling very, very depressed and at loss because he'd experienced so many losses, and at the end really described himself as feeling productive again, which when you think about living while dying is really what I think we aspire to in terms of quality of life. Participants talked a fair bit about the benefits of normalization, the fact that they realized that there were other adults in the community struggling with this, and so that they weren't alone in that struggle, and that there was a program that acknowledged the needs of this particular population. overall, I think it was really profoundly a benefit of what they would describe as social support. As one participant said, you know, cancer is not just the physical thing, it's an emotional wound. And described the volunteer, she's sort of like a placebo, in that she's not going to cure my cancer, but she makes it a lot more livable. Another participant said, you know, it definitely had a quality impact, first of all, to have a conversation with such a pleasant person. Right there, it's positive. So even if there's no value beyond that, we would hope it was $1 million value, but even if it's just spare change, it's very important spare change. And so really the narrative, I think, across the older adults was really this idea of making life more livable. So the lessons really that we learned from this pilot, I think the pilot was successful to a large extent. We did learn that it's really important to have continuing mentorship and ongoing education for the volunteers, flexible visit strategies, strategies also to raise awareness of the program in the community. Some of the cautions, I think, in terms of thinking about you know, the success of this project, this study site where we did it had a nurse navigator previously, and so the program already had some visibility in the community, some rapport had been developed, and there'd really been intensive research team and community engagement for years before we mounted this program. So I would say when we think about a program of this nature, we're really looking in terms of implementation and sustainability really being probably a multi-year effort overall. And what we still really need to know is how to best connect NCARE volunteers to healthcare to ensure that they really get the ongoing support they require for this somewhat complex role. So our next steps, I'm delighted to say that we do have funding to roll this out more broadly. We have funding, and we're actually in process right now of scaling it up. We have funding from CIHR to implement and evaluate in 6 communities nationally with both a non-cancer and a cancer population. We have funding from the Canadian Cancer Society to implement and evaluate in 3 BC communities specifically with an advanced cancer population, and really trying to tie this program very closely to what we have in BC, which are community oncology clinics, which are satellite oncology clinics located in rural communities throughout BC. And of course, with funding, we're working on a toolkit right now for implementation and scale up. So thank you. I will turn the presenter control back to you and let you facilitate the questions and comments.
Thank you, Barbara. That was an excellent presentation, and I'm so glad to hear that you've got so much funding for future work in this area. I understand now both you and Wendy will be answering questions, and to the audience, please continue to send us your questions and we'll try to get to them all if possible and time permitting. And Carrie Kim, our Canadian Frailty Network Manager of Research and IP, will be facilitating the Q&A, and he'll start now. Thank you. Go ahead, Perry.
Hi, Barb. Great talk, by the way. Just to start off, the first question we have is there's been some critique of navigation as being another layer added to an already fractured healthcare system. How might the NCARE model fit with the currently existing healthcare services?
Great. Wendy, would you like to jump in with that one?
Yeah, I will. And Barbara and I have talked about this a lot, and as we've engaged other communities, have thought about this. I think one of the things that's really important in the way we've defined navigation is about that connecting and accessing resourcing. And I think the other piece that's so very important is to remember that what distinguishes it from other navigation models is the really, and you can tell from the data Barb shared, is it's so much more than healthcare services. And what's really important to older adults in the community is so much more than healthcare services. There definitely needs to be a link to this. I think some of the things that we've read about concerns about navigation is that it shouldn't be a panacea for fixing the healthcare system. But I'm hoping that you can see from what Barb has shown you is how distinctly different this is from any other service that is being provided. And it definitely came, without a doubt, from people in rural communities themselves. We did not start on this project ourselves. It was a request that came from rural families and older adults. So the attempt is not to overshadow the need to make some changes in the healthcare system, but what this navigation does is far broader than the healthcare system, and it's definitely addresses a gap. But I'm not sure I answered that well. So Barb, do you want to jump in?
Oh, no, I think that's brilliant. Thanks, Wendy.
Well, thank you very much. Next question we have is a three-part question, if you will. I'll ask them one at a time. What kind of backgrounds did the volunteers have?
Yeah, I'll answer that one, Wendy. So we had, so all of the volunteers had extensive volunteer experience. Not all within hospice. Some had been with other volunteer agencies in the community, but they all had a lot of volunteer experience. And most of them also had some healthcare provider background as well, or again some sort of comparable training where they had been very used to providing psychosocial support under challenging circumstances. So on this, initial pilot, we had actually made that a requirement. They needed to undergo a screening interview and reference checks and a criminal record check and all of those kinds of things that we do within hospice agencies. But there has been some controversy as we've gone back and forth debating whether these volunteers need to have a healthcare background, or does that just muddy the water a fair bit in terms of, making it a challenging role for them, because the boundaries then become quite blurred as retired healthcare providers or currently working healthcare providers and their volunteer role. And I must admit we're still going back and forth a bit on that one. But yes, at this point, these volunteers were very hand-selected. They had lots of background preparation for this role.
So Barb, were there certain backgrounds or things in terms of the screening that disqualified volunteers, and if you could share some of those?
Yes, so people were not disqualified in this pilot, and why it worked out that way is that we were in a rural community where there was a lot of familiarity within the community and with the hospice, and so people were approached in some ways from the nurse navigator to ask if she was also involved in hospice, and so she was able to kind of solicit interest and also knew these people quite well. So there was no screening out of volunteers in the pilot, although I could see that happening as we roll out more broadly.
Right, absolutely. One question I had just occurred to me in terms of as these volunteers sort of build relationships with the client or the citizen over time, I must imagine they get really close to these patients or these clients. Is there a concern that these volunteer navigators might feel a significant loss when those particular clients sort of pass away? And what sort of training might these volunteers have to cope with that?
Oh, such a good question. And we did experience that in the pilot. One volunteer in particular had a couple pass away during the time that she was volunteering, and I think it's probably fairly similar to what hospice volunteers go through on a regular basis, although perhaps exacerbated because they are walking with these individuals over such a prolonged period of time. And it was interesting when we started the pilot, we had these coaching times with the nurse navigator where they got together and they talked about the issues that they were experiencing, and we quickly realized that the time that we had set aside for this coaching session and even with this small amount of volunteers was really not enough. They had these issues that they needed to talk about and to support one another and to give each other feedback. And so I think for a program of this nature, that type of mutual support and coaching and mentorship and times to debrief are absolutely critical.
And I think I'm just going to add to that, because one of the things that we've done in the training was build on the CHPCA volunteer manual. And I think that's helpful too, because it has a great deal of information, but you know, as we've also gone through this, as we revised the healthcare provider one, we put in sections on what is the best evidence to support volunteers, so that those supporting volunteers also have this and understand that, and understand the great importance for support. When we did a review of the systematic reviews of navigation programs, outstanding and the successful ones were the training and the ongoing support. So, Barb, sorry, I'm just emphasizing your point there.
Yeah, that's great, Wendy. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Very helpful. I'll get back to the second part of the original question. Second part being, what advice do you have for others doing research in rural areas to learn about the hidden resources in communities?
Wendy, would you like to take that one?
I'll start, because one of the things that was important that we have the volunteers do is a bit of a simple windshield survey. So there is a tool in the manual, and what they do is they have to walk around their communities and see what's there with different eyes. And then the other piece that's part of navigation is the importance of being connected in the community and being visible in the community, and that ongoing finding out of community resources. And sometimes they aren't there, and we're involved in a new project right now. And one of the examples I still find in this new project quite telling for me is a small community, and there was nothing like Meals on Wheels, and the older adult just to come back from the hospital that was on receiving navigation services and just needed some meals, but the navigator knew the volunteer, knew the funeral director, knew they had a list of people that they had for funerals to get meals, and in a sense connected and helped in that way. So it definitely is an ongoing experience for them. We also provide them up front with the community resource guide, don't we, Barb? But it's a living document. So they add, and so it's been, and in some ways, a good community capacity building exercise too.
Right, thank you. So in terms of sort of sustainability, how would one, well, maybe you could provide some advice in terms of how one would constantly update the sort of the hidden resources, so that, I think one of the big problems with a lot of these sort of websites and other documents in terms of resources is that they get outdated very quickly. So how would one approach sort of a way of keeping those sort of documents or that information updated in a more timely fashion? How do you personally do it?
Yeah, so we found that the volunteers, as they worked with the older adults, were actually quite good at finding new resources and sharing among themselves what was available. So I think what we're envisioning from a sustainability perspective is that once a hospice society has an NCARE program, that kind of ongoing sharing would continue to happen, and that guide would automatically stay updated, because it's very community specific. And it was interesting the number of times, you know, when volunteers would sit with an older adult and realize that, you know, there was a need there, and then they would go home and they would kind of call, you know, different people to try and find out what was available. They would identify something that they might not have known about previously and then come back and share it with the other volunteers that they could then sort of add to their toolkit. So I think within particular communities, it will be quite sustainable. The piece of the guide that sort of looks at the broader internet resources available to people, or sort of the more national resources, we only included the ones that, you know, are fairly gold standard and, you know, don't tend to change over time, sort of the best of the best, and we're hoping that helps the sustainability issue in some way.
Right, thank you. Question that we received just now is sort of related to your palliative trajectory slide that you put up very early on. And the question is basically, do you think NCARE or similar programs implemented early on in that trajectory, and maybe this is a bit ambitious, might be able to influence the trajectory of that person's sort of palliative decline, if you will, or slope?
Yeah. Wendy, do you want to start with that one?
I think and I hope I'm interpreting your question correctly, right? The focus of the volunteers, and the focus, because we did all that up from conceptual work, is about quality of life. So they, in essence, ask two questions at each visit. You know, what is most important to you today, and what is the three most important things we could do to help you improve your quality of life. It's so, in essence, that guides the whole program, and so it's not about changing the trajectory, right? It's about neighbors helping neighbors walk together, so that the isolation that we found in other research that occurs as older adults go through this trajectory is relieved. Some of the significant changes they're experiencing, there's not the same distress and pieces. So it's not a medical focus at all. Could it potentially, because if you notice from Barb's slides, some of it's about how to talk to healthcare providers, right? And how to think about if you do need that access. So I appreciate that you qualified that a bit in terms of not might be too ambitious. At the same time, the evidence is so clear that when we start palliative care, though, which I remember Barb was talking about making this part of hospice and more upstream, that maybe it's that combination, right? Could potentially have an impact, but that's certainly not the goal of this project. Would you say, Barb? It's more about quality of life.
Yes, yes, and I think, you know, if you could somehow draw the theoretical links between social support and longevity, you know, certainly some of the qualitative comments that the older adults talk about in terms of making life more livable, making them feeling like they're living while they're on this trajectory, becoming more engaged in life. You know, theoretically, I guess it's possible. I think it'd be a harder a harder stretch to kind of really demonstrate that, but it's sure an intriguing thought. I appreciate that question.
Okay, thanks to both of you. I know I think we could talk about this for the next 3 hours and still not have enough time, but we're getting to the 1 o'clock time that we end, and so thank you very much for presenting your work. And again, congrats for all the new funding that you're going to be getting in the near future, if you haven't already, to further this work. And I just want to draw your attention to everyone on the audience, to the screen, that please, if you can, take a moment to provide feedback. It'll pop up on your screen shortly. And I hope you can all join us on the next webinar. It will be as good as this one, I'm sure. Hard to top this. But again, thanks. And I guess that's the end of our webinar. Thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.